Okay, so much for that. Let's go back to our other issue. There he is. Dave, can you hear me?
I hear you. How you doing?
Doing great, doing great. We've got an excited group here that was going to get a pretty dry lecture on consumer and producer surplus, so they're happy to see you, I'm sure.
Awesome.
Okay, as we were saying, and I'm hoping that we will, can you see what we have on the screen here?
Yes, I certainly can, yes.
Okay, so that's kind of just some topics we talked about with the class. I've sent them excerpts from the last couple of observers just to try and keep them up on what's going on, and we actually asked them to read the article in yesterday's Wall Street Journal on the Saudi Arabia situation with WWE. So I think, as I was mentioning in the class, you've done a lot of things. We've got the editor for the student paper here. I don't know if I'm going to pressure him to ask a question or not, but you kind of got your start, I guess, in traditional sports and wrote for the National. We mentioned that Frank Ford said that you were the most esteemed journalist out of a very all-star group that wrote for the National, and you've covered wrestling and mixed martial arts basically since the inception, and I guess wrestling for about 40 years. So what we might do is ask you to give a quick bio of yourself in addition to what I said, and then I'm hoping that most of this, I have some questions obviously we can talk about, but I'm hoping that most of this will be driven from the class and that they can ask you about any of these issues that we've talked about or something that's on their mind. We've got a pretty sharp group in here. So you might, if you can give us a little bio, and then we'll hopefully turn it over to the students. Yeah,
I started, writing about sports probably as a child, and then went to San Jose State. I actually started with pro wrestling at the age of 11. I would write about that when I was a kid, and then I went to college. After college, I started the Wrestling Observer newsletter. I worked for a couple of newspapers through about 87, and I was just driving myself crazy doing too much work between that work and the wrestling newsletter. So I chose the wrestling newsletter, which seemed like the really stupid choice at the time, but ended up paying off. And I've been doing that. I've written for the National. I've written for Yahoo. Write for MMA Fighting as well right now. So but my main job is a website, doing podcasts and writing the newsletter for the Wrestling Observer website.
Okay, maybe I don't want to do that. Okay, so again, I'll see if we have some questions from the audience. We've got a pretty vibrant set of topics here. If not, I'll certainly come up with something. Sometimes it takes someone to break the ice. And are you wanting to get up? No? Yes? Come on in, knock me out of the way. You can ask. We'd rather have questions from the students. No, we want you to come up so Dave can see you. That's all right. I think you can see you here on the camera. I don't know if I need to zoom in on that or not. Well, I'll try to figure that out. But yes.
Hi,
Introduce
Dave.
yourself.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, good. My name's Aaron. I'm a finance major and economics minor and statistics minors as well. My question is, when you're writing about a sport as prominent as the WWE, a lot of times there can be some negative press behind it, and a lot of the times that you report on it's pretty negative about the sport because you want people to know the truth and everything like that as a journalist. Has there ever been a story that you've done that WWE, whether it's the performers or the executives, have been happy that you got it out and that it helped them in some way?
I'm sure plenty of times, yeah. I mean, some stories are positive and some stories are negative when you're covering companies like that. I mean, there's business successes, there's, they do good things, they do bad things. So it's, I'm sure all the time that happens, yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think the thing with, journalism in general is people, you don't expect to get the straight story from the carnival marketer. So when you have, you have an independent expert that's commentating on these kind of issues. I think that, the people that do pick this up in the outside media would that's where they're going to look. They're not going to look to the press release necessarily. And so I've noticed over the years that people have really large misunderstandings of wrestling, and a lot of the the charlatans that may want to hide something, at least 20 years ago, could say, well, the matches are predetermined. And then the interviewer would automatically assume they're being credible about other issues. So
Right. Yeah. Even today you have similar things. I mean, that was like the John Jones thing, which was like the first topic that you did in his, in his arbitration hearing. He talked about using cocaine, and they said, "Oh," he goes, he openly talked about using cocaine and said, "But I don't do steroids," even though he failed a steroid test. And then the arbitrator goes, "Well, if he admitted that he used cocaine, then I guess he's an honest guy. So therefore, they believed him when he said that he didn't take steroids knowingly." And it cut time off of his suspension, which to me was ludicrous, but that's what they did. That actually happened right there.
And I think I don't know that I've necessarily shared this with a class. For someone with his track record, what would be a normal punishment in your view for what he did? And then you might expand a little bit on what he actually received.
Well, the normal punishment for a second offense is 4 years suspension, and he got 15 months. They cut it to 18 months because he, I guess, supposedly helped them in turning state's evidence, so to speak. But we don't know to who, and there's no, we'll see how that turns out. But that was supposedly the reason it was cut to 18 months. And then it was cut to 15 months because they believed he was honest and did not knowingly take steroids. Somehow they got in his system through, they couldn't find where they did, but they just believed somehow they didn't. He didn't do it on purpose. So that's why it ended up being a 15-month suspension, which basically ends in a couple of weeks.
And the didn't do it on purpose defense, is that usually successful?
The didn't do it on purpose defense is only successful when you can prove with a supplement or something what you, if you have a supplement and it gets tested and it has the drug that you failed for, the didn't do it on purpose thing, you usually will still get a suspension of 6 months to a year on it. But but if you don't have any evidence of something, of a supplement that would have what you failed for, it's never worked before. No. Other people have said I didn't do it knowingly. Well, everyone would say that. And I'm sure in the past in front of athletic commissions, it's probably worked, but under USADA, no, they haven't accepted that one. How could you? Because then everyone go, I didn't do it on purpose. I don't know where I got it from. It's like, what's the point of testing if you're going to believe that?
Okay. And again, if anyone wants to ask questions, we can just line up and I'll get out of the way as folks come up. I know it's hard to always think about questions, but we'd like to have more of a back and forth. I could turn the mic. We've got an audience here, about 50 folks, I guess, 50 to 60 that are pretty sharp. They've done fairly well throughout the semester. While we're talking about drug testing, could you kind of evaluate UFC, mixed martial arts, relative to the other team sports that are dominant? I think some of us have this impression that Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, I guess, have done maybe a really pretty solid job of testing with sports. We know that baseball is less dirty than it once was, given the changes that happened there. But whether that's kind of a misnomer and how you would rate, I know it's difficult to do, but I think you follow this pretty closely, how you would judge the other sports drug testing programs.
Well, I don't know I'm only really familiar with WWE and UFC, in a sense, very familiar with both. Football, the penalties are very small. Baseball, the penalties are very large. So in that sense, baseball, there's a definite, because of the fear of penalties, it's that kind of dissuades you from doing it. UFC's penalties are pretty high because it's 2 years on a first offense, and that's bigger than anyone. UFC, as far as USADA goes, the irony of USADA, because everyone's mad at them over the John Jones thing, is that I've seen more changes in UFC, and it's the cleanest it's ever been, but it's got the perception, because there have been failures, of it being dirty, of being a dirty sport. And actually, USADA has cleaned up what was a very dirty sport. It's changed it, but because of John Jones thing was really the big one, where now all the fighters are going like, wait a minute, he's been caught twice, he's a superstar, and the way they treated it, it's almost like USADA had a total loss of confidence among the fighters themselves and the media as well over this one. And I don't think that they really understood that. And UFC to a degree too, because I think there's the feeling that UFC management doesn't really care about a clean sport, because they're so, of the people who they let in, and the lack of discipline for the top guys. I think that that's hurt as well.
And I guess, I don't know, it's kind of easy to blame this, but I know you've mentioned in the past, UFC, we've talked about its growth from a $2 million to a $4 billion industry. And the sale of UFC came with some pretty heavy, interest obligations, I guess.
Very heavy, yeah.
That might, maybe if you could talk a little about the potential, we're not going to say there's corruption necessarily, but there's a potential for corruption there, because the regulating body, to some degree, or benefits from the success of the sport, particularly in individual states. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, UFC pretty much like when it comes to discipline of things, they kind of put most of it, not all of it, but most of it on the athletic commissions that regulate them. And the athletic commissions, I mean, for the most part, I think that the job the athletic commissions, they tried to do an honest job. I think that when it came to the drug issues, most of the commissioners, not all, in the key states were very naive to that process, because they were more political appointees. And I don't think they really understood the psychology of the drug use and things like that. But to a degree, they've gotten up to speed, but only to a degree. But the thing is that there are a few people in the sport, because it's such a weird sport in the sense that there's a handful of people at any time. Sometimes there's nobody, but right now there's like a handful of people who are big draws, and the commissions want those fighters to fight in their state, particularly Nevada, because the amount of money that like a Conor McGregor or John Jones, just an example, can generate over and above a normal show is gigantic. And the commissions are funded by a percentage of that money. So it is to their economic benefit to not suspend those type of guys for a long period of time, whereas a rank and file fighter, there's no benefit. I mean, they're rank and file, and they're not going to get the same treatment. I mean, I think that we've seen that. We saw that with Overeem in Nevada as well, where, I think that they gave him a very light suspension on a steroid test failure. And, like with McGregor, there were a bunch of different things that happened, which, but UFC didn't discipline him because he makes them way too much money. And I mean, that's the reality of the whole situation.
Students were supposed to have read about that. I'm sure they all did. So they're good folks. I'm getting some nods. That's good. I'm going to turn it over to our question from our student here. But real quickly, like if you had to rate and it's hard to do based on this one fight, but like the current, Q rating or marketability of Khabib after what happened over the weekend, even though, sometimes people would say no news is bad news and you want news. He's certainly in the news. What kind of market power he might have relative to, like, is he the second most popular fighter, the 10th most popular fighter? Is it probably hard to tell, but if you had to estimate that.
I think that we'll really know when he fights his next fight and see how that does. But based on, I ran Google searches, which is a pretty good indicator, and he was number 2 behind Conor McGregor among all the fighters. He was ahead of Lesnar, he was ahead of John Jones. So that fight, the brawl after the fight, I think that really, it really made his name much, much bigger. I mean, that's one of the other negative things is when people say that there's no, that any publicity is good publicity. That's not really true. But if you're a fighter and the publicity that you have that's negative is that you got into a fight or that you were ready to jump the fence and fight somebody, it's like it's not sportsmanlike, but it doesn't hurt the fighter's marketability. If anything, it probably helps them because that story ended up being so big.
introduce yourself.
My name's Matt. My question kind of ties into that with the post-fight antics of the fight. Because it seems like the UFC is very gung-ho on saying that it's disgusting and they don't like it. But I feel like everybody else, in the grand scheme of things, likes that stuff. And do you think like the UFC is just saying that because they're trying to uphold their integrity, but they secretly like having that kind of drama post and pre-fight, or what's kind of the situation?
It's a funny thing. I think that they don't want it to happen, but they are very happy to take advantage of it happening if it does happen. It's not like they would encourage people to do it. I'm sure they would discourage it. But like when McGregor threw that dolly through the window, I mean, they promoted that like crazy and got the biggest pay-per-view number that they ever had, by basically showing a felony on television. So at the end, it's like it's to their economic benefit. So they have to, I think it's mixed. I think they don't like the fact that it happens, but they will certainly take advantage of that if it does.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess there's a lot of directions we can go. I think, we've been talking a fair amount about the situation in Saudi Arabia and with the Leslie Smith situation. Maybe if you could expand a little bit on, we've tried to define it in class, but what you think an independent contractor should be legally and how well that fits the classification of both UFC fighters and WWE performers, and then that might tie into the lack of public statements from the talent about what's happening in WWE.
Yeah, so WWE, obviously, I'm sure you guys all know, and UFC performers are classified as independent contractors. With UFC, there's a lot more of an argument in the sense that they pretty much train the way they want to train. They do what they want to do. They're independently brought, the schedule is not given to them as much as, okay, here's a fight, here's an opponent, do you want to take it? I mean, you're certainly not encouraged to say no, but you have the right to say no. And if you're the bigger star you have, the more rights you have. And if you're injured, maybe they'll pressure you to fight, maybe they won't. But there's things you're required to do. It's kind of are you an employee or independent contractor? I mean, I think it kind of leads a little on the employee side because you're not independent. You can't go to work for somebody else. You can't, well, you can, but not fight for somebody else. So it's an exclusive contract. So to me, that doesn't really make you independent. WWE, you're not an independent contractor because they give you the schedule. They tell you who you're going to be wrestling. They tell you what you're going to say on your interviews. They script your matches to an extent for you, not completely, but mostly. There's almost not, they are, they give you your gimmick. They help costume you. I mean, there's really nothing that and again, like with you're not free to work for anybody else. So to me, with WWE, you would not in no way be an independent contractor.
Okay, kind of as a follow-up to that, I guess, there was a column in one of the, I guess, competing publications in Pro Wrestling Torch. I know you know Bruce Mitchell very well. And he wrote a column suggesting, and I actually issued this to the class also, that there's some free agents in wrestling now that have a decent amount of market power. And I don't know how tongue-in-cheek it was, but his suggestion was they should negotiate with WWE from the perspective of, if you sign us, you're going to give us employee status and the benefits that go along with that. Would that be a non-starter, I guess? Do you think they'd get laughed out of the negotiation, or is that a reasonable suggestion?
I think it's a reasonable suggestion in the sense that if I was them, it would be a subject I would bring up. I don't know that WWE would be open to it, but I would bring it up. Yeah. I mean, it's a weird situation. WWE does want them, so I mean, I don't expect it to happen, but yeah, I mean, there's no reason not to bring it up in talks.
And well, I'll let Raphael ask his question. Here's our editor from the Collegian, just to put a little more pressure on him.
Okay. Hey, Dave, my name's Raphael. My question is, what will it take for a change in this to happen for these independent contractors, especially for WWE, to eventually be classified as employees? Is this something that could take place within the next decade or so, or is this something that you see going on for the foreseeable future?
I think with this administration, it's probably not going to happen right now because, you know, I mean, Vince McMahon's wife is in the cabinet, and I don't think that you're going to get I don't know. It doesn't feel like you're going to get a court ruling against them or any kind of or an NLRB ruling against them. But as far as could it happen, I mean, I'm surprised that in a sense it's gone on as long as it has. Blumenthal, you know, when he was running against Linda McMahon, had promised people he was going to look into that situation, and then he didn't at all. He didn't even touch it. You know, he ran for the Senate in Connecticut against Linda McMahon many years ago. You know, you could sue, but nobody wants to sue WWE because of the idea that you know, you pretty much lock yourself out of going there, and everybody wants to go there. And then by the time they realized, hey, I'm not going back, your statute of limitations is run out because there was a lawsuit. There was an independent contractor lawsuit a couple of years ago that was thrown out based on statute of limitations that they had been gone for too long to file this suit. So, you know, that's the negative on it. Nobody wants to risk their career over it or risk being able to go back over it. So it's kind of like why it still exists today. I mean, there were times, and you know, when the old wrestling, the wrestlers really were independent contractors for you know, up until I couldn't, you know, up until the 80s, maybe, you know, I mean the mid 80s. And then once you start signing exclusive contracts, which would date back to about 84, 85, 84, that's when it changed. But it's 84 is 34 years ago now, and you know, they're still viewed as independent. They're somehow still viewed as independent contractors.
Do you think it's more likely that a court case decides this, or that the WWE decides to bargain with these wrestlers?
If the wrestlers now, because of the nature of the television deals that go into place, I think it's not going to happen. But if the wrestlers in September 2019 all got together and said, look, these TV deals are coming, and we should get our, you know, road expenses paid, and we should get employee status and things like that. And they, as a group in September 2019, said we're going to band together on this. I think WWE, because of the size of those television deals, it would be something that they could probably win. But the idea of them sticking together, no one in management believes that they will, and there's no history of them doing so. So that's the deal.
Thank you.
And I guess, come on up. I guess just to follow up on that while another student's coming up, the odds, I mean, WWE is getting hammered right now in terms of publicity, at least to a degree, although they've survived that before. A outside advisor might suggest that they give in on this particular issue before it does ever go to court, if it ever does, and it would get them some goodwill. But I guess that's just not very consistent with their way of thinking.
You know, when they have that much money, there's certainly no argument against it anymore. I mean, the original argument was that, you know, it was a low profit margin business, and, you know, that would change the profit margins greatly. Now it's such a high profit margin business that, you know, the idea of not, you know, it's kind of like the rules that they go by on how they pay talent, on expenses on the road, you know, and a lot of those things that were done in a day when it was a hand-to-mouth business are no longer, I mean, they're no longer relevant in today's version of WWE wrestling, but they're still there just because it's great for management. You know, it increases their profits, and the wrestlers have never fought together enough to get it changed.
How you doing? My name's Jacob.
Hey, Jake.
I was wondering, do you predict that UFC fighters will receive a higher percentage of revenue anytime in the near future? And if so, what will it take to do that?
And Dave, maybe if you could illustrate the percentages they receive, WWE people receive. We know the major sports are close to 50%.
The major sports are close to 50%. UFC's 13 to 14%. WWE, the last I saw, was 8%. So yeah, there's a giant difference. I mean, WWE does have more of an infrastructure and front office than most of your major sports franchises. But still, that doesn't explain what I just said. And UFC, to a degree, does as well. But the profit margins of WWE, especially the expected profit margins going forward, and of UFC are enormous compared to a regular sports team. And one of the reasons is because they pay the talent so much less by percentage.
Thank you.
So yeah, probably not a lot of indications that UFC is going to ratchet up that pay anytime soon. And as you mentioned, they have those debt obligations where they're a little tighter to the line, I guess, than
yeah. I mean, they did for McGregor because he had power over them. So McGregor's percentage is much, much higher than anyone ever has before because he fought him tooth and nail and he had the power of generating revenue. But for an average fighter, yeah, there's always been talk of collective bargaining or attempt unionization or things like that, but it's never really gotten off the ground when it comes to UFC. And with WWE, it hasn't even been. Guys talk about it, but it hasn't even been serious talk in 30 plus years.
Yeah, they had. I guess they had the threats of unionization in the mid '80s, and
Jesse Ventura tried to unionize the wrestlers, and it didn't happen. And I've heard of nothing when it comes to WWE. I mean, not even like discussions that ever went anywhere since then. Guys talk about it, but not. Not even a process of anyone wanting to spearhead it or anything like that. Because I think that the feeling is that if they do, they'll be fired, and everyone wants to. They're afraid of their job. That's the basic gist of it.
Lost my train of thought there. What was I going to talk about? We could use a question from the audience here. I did lose my train of thought. I apologize. You mentioned the market power that Conor McGregor has with UFC. Are there other? I know there are to lesser degrees. Are there any other fighters that approach that? You've got Brock. Say Cormier says I'm not going to fight unless X, Y, and Z. Do they just kind of say okay, or do you think that some of these fighters have more negotiating power?
Cormier would have some power. Lesnar has incredible power because everyone knows that he's got options. So Lesnar's got more power in WWE and in UFC because of those because they could go either one. So he does for himself, yes. John Jones does, obviously, but it's. Other fighters have had money issues, and it's kind of like, well, you need us more than we need you, type of a thing.
I guess I'll go a little off topic. Again, we've got a captive audience. I'm hoping they'll ask more questions. But as you've written about, mixed martial arts, which I think people at first misunderstood, and certainly about wrestling, which people don't understand to this day, I guess. How have you dealt with, I don't know if that's a stigma or if that's like just something where, like when you try to tell people what you do for a living 20 years ago, like, did you even bother? Or just some of the stories you might tell about covering such an unusual genre?
Yeah, I talked about it. Yeah, I think people kind of years ago, when it was wrestling, people would go like, "Don't you know it's not real?" And it's kind of like, please, But I think now people are more. There is more of an intrigue about it. People kind of know it exists, and they see it as a much bigger business, than they did in the past. Even if it's, it is business-wise, it is much bigger than it ever was. So it's not as negative. I think that, I don't think people, even to this day, I don't really think people understand what I do. So,
what are some, I don't want you to give your proprietary information, but what are some indicators that when you see X and Y happen that you think business is going to pick up in terms of interest in the way you cover both wrestling and MMA?
Well, MMA is all star power dependent and big fight dependent. You know, when there's a big fight, there's a lot of interest, and when there's not, it's, you know, just kind of there. With wrestling, it's more difficult. You know, I think wrestling thrives on competition, and there really hasn't been much competition in years. So in that sense, you know, its lifeblood is television exposure, which it has. It's got good enough exposure, but television is getting more and more fragmented. I guess the big boom periods come from giant stars, and we haven't. John Cena was a good-sized star, but he wasn't a giant star. We haven't had the giant star since Steve Austin and The Rock, and then before that, Hulk Hogan. So nobody at that level. In today's pro wrestling, it's not as popular mainstream as it was when you had those guys. So it's kind of like when those guys come along, and you can't make them. They just show up. You know what I mean? It's like everyone tries to make them, but you know, it used to be you just have them beat everybody, and they kind of would get over if they can talk pretty good. But now everything is so fragmented, and so it's what's the word I'm looking for? Everything is under the thumb of the organization. So it's more about the organization than the individual, which leads you to steadier business, because kind of like when the organization comes to town, okay, we want to see it. Whereas before it's like, what's the match? And if there's a big match, it's high. And if there's not a big match, it's low. Now it's kind of in the middle, and it's steady, but you don't have the big, you know, matches that you would have in the past that were the larger than life matches. I mean, we really haven't had one of those in years. You know, those John Cena and The Rock would probably have been the last real big one. And that's the kind of thing that those type of things will grow the business, like a Conor McGregor Khabib fight grew the UFC business and interest level greatly in a short period of time.
I'm going to ask one more quick follow-up question, then we have a student waiting. Do you think there's the possibility that, you know, Mark Cuban's somewhat involved with New Japan Wrestling, realistic, or maybe even try to put not an exact percentage, but the odds that someone outside really tries to compete in wrestling, which might stimulate interest?
You know, the thing, I think that very well could happen now, because it's already happening in MMA. And MMA is kind of a similar economic thing where you've got the one giant company and then a bunch of smaller companies that are all trying to get a foothold. But people are putting money into these smaller companies. The one group just got $166 million in funding last week. The PFL got $27 million in funding a couple of weeks ago. So there are people putting money into secondary MMA groups. So it would make sense, given the size of the WWE TV contracts, people will look and go like, if we can get this thing at a certain level, we can make so much TV money off of it, that this may be a viable business to go into. Boxing's gotten a lot of money in like that as well. So I think that there's, whether it's a Mark Cuban, whether it's somebody else, I think it's probably the size of this TV deals that WWE signed. I think that increases the odds of people on the outside looking, going like, hey, look at the profits WWE is going to be making. They're valued at $6-7 billion now. This may be a great business to get into, because there's no number two. I mean, there's a number two, but there's no strong number two. There's a spot for a number two if you really are willing to go for it. And a strong number two, like WCW once was, in today's marketplace with the television money, would be incredibly big business. It wasn't as big in that era because you didn't have the TV money. But now you've got the potential for TV money. I would think that, yeah, I think the odds of something like that happening are fairly good.
Hi, Dave again.
Into the mic.
Gotcha. Just wanted to thank you again for coming, since we're about out of time. But I had a specific question about UFC 229 with Khabib and McGregor. And you wrote an article about how it smashed the pay-per-view records, got about 2.4 million pay-per-view.
Which I did predict, by the way. I hit 2.4 million. I have to throw that out there.
Wow, that's awesome.
You quoted my tweet, and then I was like, oh gosh, everybody sees this. I may really look foolish, and then it turned out okay.
Well, so my question is, from what I saw from a lot of people on Twitter, they were saying, oh, that was such a boring fight until like Khabib jumped out of the ring and started fighting people. And so I think, like, I wrestled in high school. I can appreciate the grappling portion, the trying to get the guy down and choke him out, anything jiu-jitsu. But I think a lot of people maybe paid for that and were expecting a knockout. Do you see UFC trying to bend the rules at all and say, like, hey, maybe you have to take a certain amount of time to try to choke the guy out and then you have to let him up or something like that? I mean, freestyle does that.
I don't see them changing the rules any more than they have to this point, in the sense there are occasional artificial stand-ups if there's no action. I don't see it getting any stronger than that. And for the UFC fan base, I haven't really seen that. If I go to a show, sometimes people will boo lack of action, whether it's lack of action standing or lack of action on the ground. But the people who go, that are the fan base, they understand the groundwork and everything like that. And UFC's grown with these rules to be incredibly popular. So I don't think that there was a point 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, where there was a lot of not understanding about the groundwork, and it may have been, to older people who only watch boxing, a negative. But when you have a generation of people who've grown up with this, I don't see it. Like, when fights go to the ground, it's not like people boo unless they become a stalemate and nothing happens. And when there's a lot of action on the ground, whether they're going for submissions or they're going for punches, the people are usually pretty okay with that. I mean, I'll watch UFC and boxing, and when I watch them on the same night, I always find a great boxing match. There is something about a great boxing match, but a rank and file UFC match to me is a lot more exciting than a rank and file boxing match, because there's so much more that can happen. So I don't think that the groundwork makes it more boring. I think it actually, the takedowns and all that, opens up more elements, and I think it actually makes it a more exciting sport.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Back again, kind of playing off of UFC some more. Kind of seen in the past years, blood sport has kind of been growing again. Kind of went away. I feel like when I was a kid, boxing, there weren't really any big matches, but since I've been in college, you've had like a couple Mayweather fights, and you had the McGregor coming back into fighting, and you had a boxing match Saturday that was pretty big. Where do you see the direction of fighting going? What's like that capstone point where it reaches the level of the NFL or NBA? And do you see boxing and UFC merging at any point to become a giant union?
I mean, I could see a possibility of one promoter overseeing both, but as far as the sports merging, no. They're completely different sports. I don't see them being as big as an NBA or NFL ever. I don't think that's going to happen. But it's going to be, again, both sports are dependent upon stars. If when Mayweather goes away, I mean, there'll always be boxing. There'll be boxing stars, but will there be boxing mega stars? That's going to depend a lot. But it'll always be there. MMA in some form, I think, is always going to be there, unless there's something in both cases where knowledge of concussions may hurt the popularity down the line. Maybe. I mean, that's something, again, that, because both are dangerous sports, as is the NFL. And there are, perhaps that could become an issue as more and more knowledge of concussions come in. But I still think those sports are going to exist in some form.
Cool. Thank you. Are there any, I guess De La Hoya is trying to promote both. That's pretty unusual, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and UFC wants to promote boxing. And Vince McMahon tried to promote boxing and thought about promoting MMA. So the idea of a promoter who's been successful wanting to do the other one, I think that will probably happen. I think that there will be boxing promoters that will try MMA, and there will be, like UFC has talked about. I mean, they have definitely talked about Zuffa boxing, but it hasn't really gotten off the ground. So I could see that, but you're not going to have a mixed, like one group, because the rules are so completely different. They're two completely different sports.
Okay, we have another question from the audience here. We got about 4 or 5 minutes left.
Hi, Dave. I was wondering if the Khabib-McGregor bout, the match before that, I think it was the Tony Ferguson fight. Do you think that since all of the focus was on the promotion about like all the after or what happened after the fight, do you think that diminishes fighters like Tony Ferguson?
Derek Lewis also.
And Derek Lewis, but Tony Ferguson, I think, had the fight of the night.
Yeah.
That one.
He was impressive.
I think that the brawl overshadowed that story, and I think that Tony Ferguson and Derek Lewis, especially Tony, both of them, would have been the talk of the show, along with Khabib, about their wins, and instead the talk was about the brawl. So I think it did hurt to a degree. Yes, a little bit.
Thanks.
Right. I was going to ask a Missouri-centric question unless somebody comes and cuts me off, and Jacob's going to do it. So I'm going to try and sneak in something about Ben Askren before we get off the line. Yeah.
Do you think it would be in the UFC's best interest to have a rematch? And even if it would result in Conor losing, and him maybe potentially leaving the UFC?
Well, Conor's in control of what he's going to do no matter what. He could lose if he wants to fight. He's going to fight as long as he wants to fight and make big money doing it. A lot of losses will hurt his drawing power in time, of course. As far as a rematch, I think that a rematch will probably happen. I would hope that Khabib fights Ferguson first, because from a sports standpoint, it's better. From a business standpoint, it's hard to argue that that's the better fight, and they usually do promote based on business. What I could see happening is maybe Khabib fights Ferguson, and then McGregor sits out, and then when McGregor is ready to fight again, which I think won't be as quickly as Khabib, then they try to figure out, if it's Ferguson, then it's a new fight. If Ferguson beats Khabib, if it's Khabib again, they'll probably go with it at the time, because Khabib and McGregor, when they fight again, whether we'll do 2.4 million buys, I don't know, but it's going to do bigger than anything else. It may do more because of that brawl, but it'll do bigger than anything else they could do. So I think that UFC, when you're handed a big money fight, they're going to make it. It's just a question of how quick McGregor wants to fight. I don't know that. My gut is well, we'll see. But I think yes, that there will be a rematch, because the money that this one generated was too big not to have.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Again, since I can't get one last question from the audience, I'll be self-indulgent on my last question. I got to go to Waterloo and win the Jim Melby Award and inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame there. And this past year, Ben Askren received the Tragos Award, I believe it was. He's been retired. I'm a big fan. Do you think he could compete with the current top-level UFC guys?
Ben is a great wrestler, and because of that skill, I think that he would have a shot with anyone. I think it would be, and he can promote a fight. So, I believe that they're probably talking, and everything as far as, I think that he'll come back for the right fight. I think that, if it's the champion in the division is Woodley. I know that he wants to fight St. Pierre, or he would love to fight St. Pierre. Whether St. Pierre wants to do that fight, I don't know. But I think that it would be a good idea to do it. I mean, he is undefeated and everything like that. Just a question of, do they think he's big enough to draw walking in? And I don't think that he is, unfortunately. But, I mean, it's one of those things that they've talked about for years and years. I mean, really, UFC should have gotten him when he left Bellator, and I don't really, I know the reasons they said they didn't, because he was a boring fighter, but I think there's probably more to it than that.
I don't see him as that different from Khabib, I guess. So
Well, Khabib's more aggressive in brawling on the ground, but I mean, when Askren fought in Bellator, from a personality standpoint, he was excellent. He had some good fights, and he did have some boring fights. So it was a little bit of both.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. I would turn the mic or the camera on to the audience, but let's go ahead and thank our speaker. And
thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure, Dave. Thanks for the time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, guys. Remember, Friday, I did bring extra copies of the handout. So if you need one of those, we're going to go over that Friday, and we're going to talk about gambling on sports. I've posted some articles about that you need to read for Friday. And Monday is group projects. So I'll have the handouts for the group projects. Yeah. Everybody have a good couple days. Thank you. Thank you, sir. It's okay. One is better than it'll go on my door. So we have copies. I mean, we made copies, but I was like, put the original on my door.
Should be on Main Street.
Yeah. No, I saw it. It looks good. Yeah. Oh, the questions? It's like the one copy of the Collegian. I can't handle that. All right, I gotta figure out how to make sure this thing records properly. Stop share. Good question. Okay. Not in meeting. We have to stop the recording. Where's the recording? Okay. Where is it? Right. Oh, stop recording. Yes. I think that's what